Hi folks, hope you're enjoying and benefiting from our guitar lesson series. Remember, it's essential that you watch these lesson videos in order. Each lesson leads into the next, and you won't get the big picture if you skip any of the steps. Many of you have been searching for these answers for years. You might be tempted to jump ahead and look at lesson 24 because you're into the blues, but if you don't know your intervals and modes from lesson 12 and 17, you just ain't going to get it. Consider purchasing the 150-page official course handbook for $19.95 from our website at www.absolutelyunderstandguitar.com. You'll find that link multiple places here on our YouTube channel. Each of the 32 video lessons has a corresponding printable page that you can view to help with review and memorization. All of the charts and graphs I create in the videos are reprinted there. The package also includes our amazing chord, scale, and arpeggio encyclopedia containing most every useful finger pattern known to man. Reserve your copy today. If you like what you're learning here, tell all your friends and like and subscribe to our channel. So enjoy this lesson and continue on, and you will absolutely understand guitar.
Okay. Hi, welcome back to Absolutely Understand Guitar. I'm your host, Scotty West. This is lesson 5, so make sure you're looking at page 5 in your book. Today we're going to be learning more about chords. We learned a lot of basic stuff about chords last time, and there's a lot more to know that we'll be tackling later on in the program. As always, make sure you're reviewing your previous lessons. Remember, all this information is interconnected. Okay, ready? Here we go. Hi, how you doing? Today we're going to be talking more about chords. We didn't quite get everything done last week and a few other things. So I'm going to do a quick little review here too, because that was a lot of stuff last week, wasn't it? Here, if you look up on here, you'll see some of the things we learned about chords last time. There are about 45 different types of chords: major, minor, 7, 9, augmented, and diminished. They all express different moods, so the more types of chords you can learn, the more emotion you can express in your music. We're only looking at 6 types of chords right now: happy-sounding major chords, sad-sounding minor chords, bluesy-sounding 7 chords, sad and bluesy-sounding minor 7s, mellow and peaceful major 7s, and angry and severe-sounding power chords like you hear in hard rock music. Now, there's 45 different types of chords, but let's take one type of chord. For example, a happy-sounding major chord. How many major chords must there be? Well, remember, there's 12. Everything in music comes in 12s because there's 12 notes. So that means there's 12 keys to play in. So there's 12 major chords, there's 12 minor chords, there's 12 7 chords, there's 12 of everything in music. So, if there's 12 different major chords, how come I only wrote down 5 of them? Well, the answer to that is, remember, there's only 5 basic possible finger forms. There are physical limitations as to what you can do with your fingers on the neck of the guitar. And even though there are 12 chords you'd like to be able to play, there are not 12 unique and individual different finger shapes that you can employ on the neck of your guitar to play these chords. Turns out there's only 5. But that doesn't mean that you can't play all 12 chords. Remember, you can use any one of these 5 basic finger shapes to actually play all 12 chords. You just have to understand that that's what bar chords are all about. So you can take any one of these basic shapes, put the bar across to replace what the open strings are in these open tuning shapes, and then as you move up the neck of the guitar, you're simply moving up in key. For example, if I take this E major chord here, turn it into a bar chord, and move it up 1 fret, it becomes an F major chord. If I move it up again, it's an F sharp major. G, G sharp, A sharp, B, C, C sharp, D. I can play all 12 chords using the E form. I can play all 12 chords, major chords, using the A form. A, turn it into a bar chord, move it up. A sharp, B flat, B, C, C sharp, D flat, D. I can play all 12 chords using the D form. D, D sharp, E, F, F sharp, so on and so forth. So there's, not only can you play all 12 chords on the guitar, but there's actually 5 ways to play every chord, and that's what bar chords are all about. Some of you have probably heard of bar chords before. Another very important thing to remember about every chord you play is all chords have roots. All chords have root notes. And the root note of a chord is the lowest note that you're playing that has the same name as the chord has. So, for example, in our E form chord up here, the root note of this E major chord would be the lowest E that you can play, and that is your open low E string down there, down there. You always want to know where the root note of any chord you play is, for a variety of important reasons, but not the least of which is, as a general rule, we're going to learn about variations on this later, but as a general rule, don't play notes that are lower than the root of the chord. So if you ever wondered why, when you play some of these chords, your low strings are X'd off, for example, in A form, since your root note is on the A string, most of the time you're not going to play that low E string. That's why those X's are there. That's because those would be notes that are lower than the root note on the A string. In D form chords, you don't play either of your 2 bottom strings because your root note is actually on your D string, the 3rd string up from the bottom. In C form, your root note is actually not where your bar is. It's not an open string as it is in E, A, and D. But in C form, it's that note right there that you actually play with your finger on the 3rd fret on your A string that's the root note. And in G form, even though we have an open G string further up on the neck here, the actual root note is this lowest G you can play, which is the 3rd fret on your G string down here. Okay, now I noticed that I had forgotten this, but I didn't fill in a couple of these last chords on the chart here because there were some things about them that I needed to explain a little more. So you can see that all of the chords on this page right here can be turned into bar chords. A couple of them are almost impossible to make your fingers play, but for all intents and purposes, they can all be turned into bar chords and moved up and down the neck. I'm going to show you there's some variations on a few of these chords too that we'll look at in a minute. But notice up here, major 7 in the E form. I didn't fill in that chord last week. That's because this requires a little bit of explanation. It's not really a rare chord. It's a pretty common chord. First thing to know is, even though this is the E form, you can't actually play an E major 7 chord using this shape. And I'll show you why in a second. The lowest key that you can play this shape in would be F. So actually your root note is going to be right here, which isn't an E actually, it's actually an F. Now the reason for this is, if you think of that as being your root note on the 1st fret, at the same time you're going to have to be able to play this open string up here. Now of course if we drop that root note down to be the open E string, that would mean that this note here, which is the open string on the high E, would have to be like 2 frets below where the open string is, and you simply can't do that, can you? Can you play a note on the same string that's 2 notes below or 1 note below the open string? Nope, just doesn't work. The rest of the chord shape looks like this. But along with those 4 strings right there, you also need that open string, which wouldn't be possible if we dropped this F down to an E. You try as best you can to X off your A string in this chord too. It's just a note that won't work in that key. Now the other interesting thing about this is when we played all of our other bar chords, our finger went actually straight across the neck on 1 fret like that, and that's the way most bar chords work. This is a little bit of an odd bar chord because when you play this one further up the neck, if you look at this right here, you see you'll need to play that note right there with your bar finger on the 1st fret, but you'll also have to play with the back part of your finger this other note here. So this is a kind of a strange bar chord where your finger is kind of on an angle like that. It isn't actually on just 1 fret. And I'll show you what I mean on the neck of the guitar here. Certainly if I play this F major 7, and wouldn't you agree that this, like all major 7s, is a peaceful sounding chord, mellow, peaceful, like something you might hear in a James Taylor song. Just a nice, pleasant sounding chord. I've got the shape that's on the chart there with my fingers. Now, if I move up one and play an F sharp major 7, same basic mellow sound, just a little bit higher in pitch. If I go up one more, G major 7, G sharp major 7, A major 7, and so on and so forth, all the way up the neck. Take a look at this fingering right here. Now, we see that we have our 3 fingers right here in the arrangement that we're expecting, but take a look at my bar finger right here. If I lift my other fingers out of the way, notice how it's not going straight across the neck the way most other bar chords do. I'm playing with the tip of my finger here. I'm playing a note on my low E string, and then interestingly enough, back here, I'm actually using the fleshy part of the back part of my finger to play a note on the high string on the previous fret. Kind of interesting, huh? Most of the time we think of bar chords as going straight across like that, but this is an example of one where your finger's actually on an angle. There's a couple of other of these too, which you'll see, particularly in more advanced types of chording. So I just wanted to explain a little bit about that. Now, another thing I want to show you is there are certain variations on some of these. Not all of these things lend themselves terribly well to bar chord playing, but in open tuning positions, you may have noticed, for example, that you don't always see E7 played that way. There are some variations on these 7 chords. You can either play an E7 that way, or you can add these additional 2 notes, like that. See, either the 2 filled-in black notes or all 4 of those. It's not like one way to play it is these 2 and another way to play it is these 2. It's like either these 2 or all 4 of them. 2 different variations on an E7 chord. Same thing is true with A7. You can either just play those 2 like that, or you can add this additional note and this additional note and play all 4 of them like that. You'll see this is all on the chart that you have in your booklet too. So if you don't quite get it off the screen here, that'll be fine. Minor 7s. For example, a minor 7 in the E form has some variations too. You can either play it with that one finger right there. That's the easiest chord on the whole page, isn't it? Or there's a couple of different variations. You can either see E minor 7 played like this, or you can add these 2 additional notes and play it like that. And sometimes you even see E minor 7 played with that additional note up on the top there. Several different variations on that chord. A minor 7, likewise, then one just below it. You can either play it with those 2 fingers or add these 2 additional fingers. Later on, when you learn more about chord structure, you'll see why you could play these chords more than one way. And I think that's it, isn't it? In a G chord, a G major chord, down here, for example, you'll find that oftentimes you can add that additional note right there. This note in a G chord is actually somewhat of an optional note. You don't always see that note played. You can X that string off it. But you're going to have all these chord charts in your booklet anyway, so you'll notice all that stuff as you go. Okay, so that is just finishing up what we were talking about last time, about the actual fingerings of these chord types on the neck of the guitar. Let's go on to some more new information now. We've seen how to play these chords, and indeed one thing you got to make sure that you do is that chart that we just had there. That is a very basic vocabulary of guitar chords that every guitar player needs to know, basically no matter what style of music that you're interested in. So if you're looking at that chart in your booklet there, realize that you have to learn to play all of those shapes on that page. Over the next couple of years, it may not happen in the first song or the second song or the third song you play, but over the next couple of years, you're going to be called upon to play every single one of those shapes. So you have to learn them all. Secondly, you have to learn to play them all as bar chords, too. You have to get that concept down. You have to develop the strength in your hand in order to be able to play bar chords. You're going to find them very difficult in the beginning. It's probably going to be like a year from the day that you start practicing bar chords that you'll actually start to have some success. So you have to learn all those chords. You have to learn to play them all as bar chords. And then finally, a thing that we're going to be talking about in a little while here is you got to be able to get there just like that. You've got to be able to get your fingers there instantly. You might as well look at it that way anyway. It might not be exactly in the split second, but you really pretty much have to think about it that way. And that's a lot of work, isn't it? That's where your practicing comes in. You're going to have a lot of practicing to do with these chords. And I'm going to show you an interesting little methodology today for practicing chords that will allow you to do this in much less time than most people take to do this stuff. But before we do that, we're going to talk about another interesting subject. Every chord that you ever play has a name. You might be familiar with that from looking in songbooks and stuff like that. You see these chords, they give you the little picture of the chord box, and then it has a name, usually an alphabet letter and then a number after it. So what we need to understand is how these chord names work. So today, the first thing we're going to look at is chord names. Because not only do you have to play the chord, not only do you have to play the chord as a bar chord, no, you have to get there instantly. And the other thing is you have to know what the names of these different chords that you're playing are. First thing you want to understand about chord names are chord names have 3 parts. Although the third part is not always given. But you owe it to yourself to kind of get to the point where you understand this concept enough so that you can kind of fill in that third part of the chord name yourself. Third part of a chord name is often not given. And you need to be able to look at the picture of the chord and figure out that part. And I'll show you what that is in a second. There are 3 parts to every chord name. Chord names can get very wordy. Here's a chord that you might be called upon to play one of these days. You might be called upon to play a B flat minor 7 sharp 5 flat 9 in the A form. Takes like 12 words to describe one chord. Now, we're all used to having people walk up to us and say, well, play me a G chord. But it isn't quite that simple, you're going to find out. They're just giving you one of the 3 different parts of that chord name. Let's take a look at what they are. The first part of any chord name is the name of the root note. Now, remember, this could already have 2 words associated with it. We know that there's a G chord, we know that there's a D chord, but remember, there's also a B flat chord. So let's write that down. The root note could be a sharp or flat note. So we've already got 2 words just to describe the root note, B flat. The second part of the chord name is the type of chord that you're playing. Remember, we said there were about 45 different types of chords. There's major chords and minor chords. There's 7 chords. There's 9 chords. There's augmented, diminished, all these different types of chords. And in fact, the 12-word chord name that I mentioned a moment ago, the actual type of chord, I believe, was a minor 7 sharp 5 flat 9. It took 6 words for me just to describe the type of chord that I was playing. Well, in our list of chords that we have right now, we don't have anything quite that bad, but we may see a couple of additional words. For example, a major 7. So we're up to 4 words to describe this chord so far. B flat major 7. Finally, the third part of the chord name, the part that I suggested wasn't always given, is the form that you're going to play the chord in. We know that there's 5 different forms: the E form, the A form, the D form, the C form, and the G form. So the third part of the chord name is in the form. So let's say, in this case, in the A form. So the name of the chord that we're going to figure out how to play it in just a moment, that we'd like to play, is B flat major 7 in the A form. Now, how do you go about figuring out how to play that chord? Well, I'll show you. Let's get this card back up again here. I always say the best way to figure out how to play a chord from its name is to work backwards through the name of the chord. In other words, look at the form first. For example, we're noticing that we're going to play this chord in the A form. And why that's significant is when you're trying to look at this chart here and figure out how to play this chord, since it's in the A form, you don't have to look at the entire page here. If it's in the A form, you know it's going to be in this row somewhere because this horizontal row here is all of your A form chords. So we've narrowed it down to chords that are in that row there. The next part of this chord name, working backwards, is the type of chord, which is a major 7 chord. So now we can kind of triangulate. We know that we're in the A form, and if we look at these vertical columns here, we see that the major 7s are in this vertical column, so we can triangulate and find out that the actual shape that we're going to use to play this chord with is that shape right there. That's a major 7 chord in the A form. And doesn't it sound peaceful and mellow, like major 7 chords are supposed to? Now, however, if I play this in its root position, excuse me, down at the bottom of the neck here, this would not be the chord that we're actually looking at right now, which is B flat major 7. It would actually be the open tuning version of that chord where the root note is on your A string. So actually, the chord that I'm playing at that moment is a major 7 in the A form, but I don't have the right root note yet. That would actually have been an A major 7 in the A form. But they want me to play a B flat major 7 in the A form. So what that means is I'm going to have to turn that shape into a bar chord shape, and I'm going to have to move it up the neck the appropriate number of frets to change it from an A to a B flat. Now, so here I've got my A major 7 chord shape here. To turn it into a bar chord, I rearrange my fingers so that I'm playing those exact notes, but I'm no longer employing my index finger. My index finger is free. That's where my bar is going to be. Right now, my bar is actually off the neck. It's really the open strings are playing those notes. But now they want me to play a B flat major 7 chord. Can you tell how many frets am I going to have to move this shape up in order to change it from being a major 7 to a B flat major 7? Any idea? The answer is just 1 fret, because what is the name of the next note higher than A? It's A sharp, or what's another name for A sharp? B flat. So what I would have to do to play a B flat major 7 in the A form is simply move it up 1 fret. And there it is right there. So this is why it's so important to know your chord names, because they're going to be telling you, oh, play me a C minor 7 in the D form and all this different type of stuff. And you're going to have to pretty much instantly be able to go in and figure out how to finger these different shapes. I'm going to give you a couple of ones to try. What you might do is pause your VCR while you're watching this and take a little bit of time and see if you can figure out how to play these various chords. And I'll take a couple of seconds, and then I'll show you how you'll actually play them. So, for example, let's look at this little thing right here. This is just a little chord box chart that I made here. And we're going to try to fill in the 3 different parts of, we're going to figure out how to play this chord from its name. What if I asked you to play me a flat, that's the root note of the chord, minor 7 in the E form. So our challenge here is to figure out how to play an A flat minor 7 in the E form. Now, take a minute and pause your VCR and see if you can figure out how to do this yourself. I'll walk you through it in just a second. Ready? Go ahead. Okay, now, an A flat minor 7 in the E form. Work backwards through the name of the chord. So, of course, the first thing you're going to have to look at is the fact that we're going to be playing this chord in the E form. So we know it's going to be somewhere in this upper row up here. E form. We work backwards another click in the name of the chord here, and we find out that the type of chord we're going to be playing is a minor 7. So we know we're in the E form. Here's the vertical column for minor 7 chords, so we can triangulate again and figure that this is the basic finger shape that we're going to be using to play that chord with. But that would be an E minor 7 in the E form if we played it just like that, if we played it in its open tuning version. Like that. But they want us, finally, the third part of the chord name that they want us to straighten out is they want us to play an A flat minor 7 in the E form. So once again, we're going to have to turn this into a bar chord and move it up the neck the appropriate number of frets. Remember, it started off as an E minor 7 like this. If I raise it up 1 fret, what is it? It's F minor 7, right? Because F, remember, is the next note higher than E, no sharp and flat between E and F. If I move it up again, it's F sharp or G flat minor 7 in the E form. Still in the E form. Move it up again, and it's a G minor 7. Move it up to so my bar is on my 4th fret. That is G sharp, or A flat. So there is the actual chord. Bar on the 4th fret, and then using this E minor 7 chord shape up here in this box right there. So how would it look? I'll show you on the purple paper how our final chord would look. Remember, in E form, your root note is down on your low E string. That's also where your bar is, so your bar is going to be going all the way across like that. And then you'll just have this one finger down here, like that, because if we look at this much of the chord box, we see that that E minor 7 looks just like this E minor 7 does up here. It's just that now the bar here is replacing the open strings. Now remember, I had to go up to the 4th fret in order to actually play this chord. So you'll notice in a lot of chord charts, they actually give you, they'll put a number 4 here, indicating that that's your 4th fret. Otherwise, I'd have to draw 4 blank frets down here, wouldn't I? Which would just clutter up the page too much. So if you've ever noticed these little chord boxes and you see a little number written next to a fret, that's the fret that that's actually supposed to be on. These numbers can go all the way up to like 19 or depending on how many frets you have on your guitar. Right now, we only had to go up and put our bar on the 4th fret. So there it is right there. A flat minor 7 in the E form. Let me give you another one of these. Try this one now. Whoops. What if I said, play me a E 7 in the D form? So again, work backwards through the name of the chord. Start with the form, because that's going to tell you what horizontal row it's in on your chart. Then look at the type of chord, which will tell you what vertical column to triangulate to. Then finally, the root note is going to tell you from your root note, from the open string, how many frets up you're going to have to move that bar chord in order for it to be what it is. So here's your chord that you'd like to be able to play, E7 in the D form. So pause your VCR for a second and see if you can figure out how to play this chord, okay? Okay, here's how you would actually do it. Working backwards, D form. So we know it's going to be somewhere in this D form horizontal row right here. So we've narrowed it down a little. The next thing is the type of chord you're going to be playing is a 7 chord. That's this vertical column right here. So you can triangulate and see that that's the basic finger shape you're going to be using right there. So I can play that on the neck of my guitar. And that's a kind of a bluesy. Remember, 7 chords are kind of bluesy sounding chords. Oh, oops, what am I doing? Wrong shape. Here we go. Kind of a bluesy sounding type of chord. But in open position, in D form, my root note is on my D string here. So the actual name of this chord is D7 in the D form, but they want me to play an E7 in the D form, so I have to turn it into a bar chord and move it up a certain number of frets. How many is that? Well, if it's D7 here, if I move it up one fret, what will it be? D sharp 7 or E flat 7. If I move it up again, what will it be? E. Now I've gone from D to D sharp to E, and there's my chord right there, E7 in the D form. Let's draw a picture of it. Remember, we had this basic shape that you'll see is a 7 chord in the D form there. And all we had to do was move it up 2 frets so that this note right here, remember your root note in D form is on your D string, so that would actually be on your 2nd fret on the D string, which is actually an E. Your bar goes across on this fret right there, and you play that shape. Now, another thing to remember is since your root note is in D form is on your D string, then you don't have to play the 2 bottom strings. Those would be notes that are lower than the root of the chord. So we see these X's up here. Remember, you don't always play all 6 strings on the guitar. Oftentimes, you're only playing 4 or 5 strings. So, and that, you know, you wouldn't always see that, but that would be just your 2nd fret right there that was on. E7 in the D form. Another interesting thing about D form chords is, as bar chords that is since your 3 fingers are playing your 3 upper strings up here, and since you don't need to play either of your 2 bottom strings, the bar doesn't really have an awful lot to do in D form. Really, all it really has to do is just play your root note. This really hardly has to be a bar at all, because these 3 fingers are going to be taking care of these strings here. So when I play this E7 in the D form, even though I'm thinking of it as a bar chord, this index finger here doesn't really have to be playing as a bar. It really only has to play your root note right there, because these 3 fingers are taking care of the top 3 strings. And you're not playing your 2 bottom strings because they're notes that would have been lower than the root of the chord. Okay, let me just give you one more example. I'm going to leave you on your own to figure out how to play this one yourself. But just so I can give you one last form. We've done one in the E form, one in the A form, and one in the D form. What if I said, play me a E flat, major 7 in the C form? So the chord in question is E flat major 7 in the C form. How would you play that? So pause your VCR and see if you can figure out how to do it. Okay, C form, of course, is down in this row down here, going across the page like that. So we know it's going to be there. Major 7 is going to be this basic finger shape here. But if I played that down at the bottom of the neck, that would be C major 7 in the C form. But they want me to play an E flat major 7, so I'm going to have to turn it into a bar chord and move it up the neck a few frets. So here's my basic finger shape. Again, major 7 chord is a nice, peaceful, mellow sounding chord. That's C major 7 in the C form. Rearrange my fingers so that I'm playing that same chord, but my index finger is free. I'm not employing my index finger. Move it up 1 fret, it would be C sharp. That's the next note higher than C. Move it up again, it would be D. Move it up again, D sharp or E flat. So there is the chord in question, E flat major 7 in the C form. On the page, it would look like this. And my bar would be across here. My root note would be this note up here, which I'm actually playing. Your low E string would be X'd off because that's a note that's lower than the root. Remember, in C form, your root note is on the A string. And for this to be E flat, this would be your 6th fret right there. Your root note would be on the 6th fret, 6, 5, 4, 3. So that means your bar would actually be down here on the 3rd fret. E flat, major 7 in the C form. Okay, that's one part of this. Now, there are two other skills that you need to be able to develop when it comes to figuring out chords and how they relate to their names. You have to be able to do the reverse of what we just did right there. The inverse skill that you have to develop is to be able to look at a picture of a chord and be able to tell what that chord is called. So, for example, let's take a look at this. Now we're going to fill in a finger shape up here first, and then we're going to try to figure out what the name of that chord is. Let's take a look at this. What if we saw a chord that looked like this? You need to be able to look at that picture of that chord and be able to tell what that chord is called. Now, I'll show you some tricks to be able to do that. Same thing is basically true. You want to work backwards through the name of the chord. So the first thing we're going to try to figure out is what form it's in. And that's easier than you might think. You might have already started looking at your chart here, looking at the whole chart, trying to figure out where you see that shape. But actually, right off the bat, you can narrow it down a little more than that. If you look at your finger shape over here, notice where your root note is. Your root note is on your A string, isn't it? Now, how does that tell you what form you're in? Well, remember, all of the different chord forms, E form, A form, D form, C form, and G form, they all have a root note, and we've identified where that root note is. Notice that this couldn't possibly be in E form, because in E form your root note is on your low E string, and in our example here our root note is on the A string, so it can't possibly be in E form. It also can't possibly be in D form, because in D form chords your root note is on your D string, not your A string. It also can't be in G form, because in G form your root note is down on your low E string as well. There's only two forms that actually have their root note on the A string. One is A form itself, and the other one is C form. So we've at least narrowed it down to these two forms. I'll tell you how to distinguish between the two of those. Notice how in A form, since your root note was originally an open string in the finger shape, that when you see this as a bar chord, your root note will be on the same fret with where your bar is, because it's like you're just replacing the open string of the chord right there. Where in C form, since your root note is a note that you're actually playing with your finger and is not a open string, then when you see this in bar chord form, you're going to notice that your root note is on a different fret from where your bar is. For example, our last major 7 example there, we saw here was our root note right here, but our bar was 3 frets back on that fret right there. That's how we knew we were in C form. But if your root note is on the same string, if your root note is on the same fret as where your bar is, and it's on the A string, you can probably assume that this chord is being played in the A form, so we can fill in that much of it. We know that this chord is in the A form at this point, which narrows things down quite a bit. We know when we look, we don't have to look at the whole page anymore. Once again, we're just going to have to look in this row right here. Now, remember, this stuff is not going to show up on the chart here as black dots, because this is where the bar is, so that means these are open strings right here. So what you have to do is in your A form row, you have to look for that configuration right there with those 2 dots right like that. And remember, it has to be absolutely exact. So, looks like that one right there, doesn't it? A minor 7 shape with those 2 dots right like that. And your bar would be right down here again where your open strings are. Looks pretty much like that shape right there. So we figured out what type of chord it is. It's a minor 7. So far we've got the form A. We've got the type of chord, minor 7. The only thing left to do is figure out what the root note is. Now, if that was played down at the bottom of the neck, it would have been an A minor 7 in the A form. But notice how our bar has moved up 2 frets from the open string. It was A when it was the open string. If we'd moved it up 1 fret, it would have been A sharp or B flat. That's the second or the first fret on your A string. Since we've moved it up again to the second fret, then it's a B. That note right there is B if you look at your finger chart, second fret on your A string. So we've identified this chord. B minor 7 in the A form, derived from that finger shape right there, a minor 7 in the A form. Let me give you one more of those too. What's the name of this chord? What are we going to call that thing right there? Why don't you take a minute, see if you can figure it out. Pause your VCR. Okay, now let's take a look at what this chord actually is. Notice now your root note is down on your low E string. Now, there's only two shapes where the root note is on the low E string. One, of course, is E form itself. So this chord might be an E form. Remember, another chord form that has its root note on the low E string is G form. But since that is played with one of your fingers instead of being an open string, your root note in this case is not going to be on the same fret with your bar. Your bar is going to be back here. In E form, up here, your root note will be on the same fret with your bar. If we look at this chord over here, we see that our root note is actually on the same fret with our bar, so we can pretty much figure out that this is in E form. So that narrows us down on our chart up here to being a chord shape that's in this row right here. Remember, where your bar is going to show up as open strings on your chart. So here's our basic configuration that we're looking for right there. At first glance, it looks something like the previous one, doesn't it? With the two dots kind of on an angle like that. But if you look carefully, you notice that those two dots are not on the same strings. Here, they were on your B string and on your D string. But over here, they're on your G string and your A string. So this is the shape that we're actually looking for now. Remember, these shapes have to be exact. They can't just be close. Well, if we're looking up in our row here, doesn't it look a lot like this? Those two notes right there. So we've figured out that this was in the E form. Now we know, if we look at the vertical column, that this has got to be a 7 chord in the E form. Only thing left to do is figure out what its root note is. Well, notice it's on the second fret on our low E string. So if it was down at the bottom of the neck where the root note was the open string, it would have been an E. But we moved it up one fret and it would become an F. And if we move it up to where it actually is here on the second fret, that would be an F sharp or a G flat. So we could say it's F sharp 7 in the E form. Now maybe you can look in your exercise book there and you'll see that there are some other chords that you can try to figure out for yourself too at home, just to quiz yourself a little more. Now, there is also, I'm not going to take the time to do this right now, but there's another problem that you have to be able to solve in this chord naming business, and that is you don't always see these chord shapes represented as full-blown 6-string, 5-string bar chord shapes. Lots of times you just see little pieces of chords, like where you're only playing on 2 or 3 different strings. Ultimately, what you need to be able to do is recognize even little pieces of these shapes, where you don't see the whole thing with the bar and everything. Maybe you're just going to see a couple of these, like maybe those 3 notes right there. You know, you're not going to see this dot down here. You're only going to see these 3 right there. But you still need to be able to recognize that as being a 7 chord in the C form. You have to kind of fill in the missing notes in your mind. And we're not going to deal with that right now. Maybe we'll do that at some later time. Okay, now, so that's all about chord names. Chord names have 3 parts, although the third part isn't always given. You've got your root note, the type of chord you're playing, and the form that you're actually playing it in. And remember, the best way to do it is kind of work backwards through it until you get to where you actually understand this. So, as I mentioned before, your challenge over the next couple of years as a beginner guitar player is you need to master all of the chords on that page. You need to be able to play them all as bar chords. You need to be able to get your fingers there instantly, just like that. And you need to make sure that whenever you look at a chord or are given a chord name, that you can actually figure out the relationship between the finger shape and the name of the chord. So, you have got to learn all of these different chords. That's what you're going to be practicing. Now, what I'm going to give you right now is kind of what I think is an interesting little methodology for practicing your chords. A very potent little formula. This will allow you to learn how to play your chords in much less time than everyone else does. And the first concept I'm going to write down is this involves what I call the sad truth about chords. This is kind of the challenge to you practicing your chords. The sad truth about chords is that playing chords, underline the word playing, is the easy part of playing a chord. And you're going to be playing some of these big, ugly bar chords, and your fingers are going to be hurting, and it's not going to be coming out sounding very good, and you're going, this is the easy part? What's the hard part? Well, I'm sure you will agree that really the harder thing about playing chords is switching with the beat. Remember, every song that you play has a rhythmic context in which these chords have to be played. That's where I said a little while ago that you might as well look at it like you have to be there instantly. So not only do you have to learn to play these chords, you have to get your fingers there in about a half a second. How do you do that? Well, it turns out then that the playing of the chord isn't really the thing that you have to practice. The more significant thing you have to practice is switching from one chord to another. And interestingly enough, you can use that in your practice regimen to actually save time practicing chords. I have this little formula here, and I'll give it to you. Best way I ever found to learn to play chords is this: practice chords in pairs. Don't just look or work on learning one chord at a time. Learn to practice chords in pairs. And what you just keep doing is you keep switching back and forth between the two chords. You might not want to practice more than two chords at a time because that would just dilute your attention to the actual chords that you're playing. If you're trying to practice 5 chords at the same time, you don't get a chance to really focus on one chord, and it just stretches your attention out over too many chords. A lot of people make the mistake of learning to play chords by learning to play songs, and a song may have 3 or 4 or 5 or 6 or 7 different chords in it, and sometimes that's just too much. You're better off just practicing chords in pairs, one at a time. That's the first line of this equation. Practice chords in pairs, back and forth every 4 beats. Now I'm going to elaborate on each one of these lines and tell you why in just a second. Practice chords in pairs, back and forth every 4 beats. Non-stop for like 5 minutes at a time. This is my famous, what I call my 5-minute rule. And we'll talk about what that means in a second. Here's one of the most important lines in this whole equation right here. Practice chords in pairs, back and forth every 4 beats, 5 minutes at a time with drums. Exclamation, exclamation, exclamation right there. We'll talk about how you practice with drums in just a minute too. Next line of the equation is make sure you don't go too fast. Slow as you need. You don't want to drive yourself crazy with this. You have to give yourself a reasonable amount of time to form that shape and get your fingers there. Another very important thing is think ahead. Don't think about the chord you're playing. It's too late to be thinking about the chord you're playing. You need to push your mind ahead of the music, and you need to be thinking about the next chord that's coming up, not about the chord that you're actually playing. Think ahead and make sure that you listen to yourself. If you practice your chords this way, you'll learn in half the time. And that's pretty cool, isn't it? You can accomplish in the next year what everybody else is going to take 2 years to accomplish. You can accomplish in the next 5 years what everybody else is going to take 10 years to accomplish. I'm going to show you how this works. Practice chords in pairs. Why? Because it's not the playing of the chord that you have to practice, it's the switching. So if we look at our other chart here, you've got all these chords to learn. You know, pick that one and pick that one. And you just go back and forth from one to the other, forming and unforming and reforming the next chord. And each time you do that, hopefully, you pick up a little more speed, and you can just keep going faster and faster and faster till literally you can get that chord in a half a second. So that's our first line. Practice chords in pairs. Back and forth every 4 beats. Why 4 beats? Well, actually, you don't have to do it in 4, but I don't know whether you know this or not, but probably fully about 80% of the songs that you've ever heard in popular music are counted in repeating patterns of 4. So we already have a fairly intuitive grasp of how to count in 4. For example, if I turn my drum machine on now here, doesn't that sound like a pretty common, normal type of drum beat that we might hear in a rock and roll song? Now that's a 4-beat pattern. If I was going to count along with this pattern, I'd be going 1, 2, 3, 4. 1, 2, 3, 4. 1, 2, 3, 4. So count every 4 beats because you already almost intuitively have a sense of that. 5 minutes at a time is our next line in the equation here. This is what I call my famous 5-minute rule. Kind of goes like this. Okay, you're practicing going back and forth between these 2 chords. Who cares whether you can do that a half a dozen times or so? Remember, the first thing you learn from me is to be a real player, you've got to be able to get to the end of the song. And remember, the end of the song might be 5 or 6 minutes away, or 3 or 4 or 5 or 6 minutes away from the beginning of the song. Who cares whether you can only play that chord a half a dozen times? For it to be useful to you as a real player, you're going to have to be able to keep it up for somewhere in the vicinity of 5 minutes. So some of this, practicing for 5 minutes, is actually about physical exercise. You may not have the strength in your hands, particularly with big bar chords. You may not have the strength in your hands to actually keep that up for 5 minutes. And so part of this is physical exercise. It's like pumping iron. It's like working out at the gym. You want to literally look at the clock and go, okay, I'm going to go back and forth from these 2 chords until 5 minutes are up, or until my hand starts to cramp up or hurt. Remember, like any physical exercise, you have to balance the no pain, no gain thing against making sure you don't hurt yourself, which you can. Don't force yourself to go too far to where you're in pain. Guitar players are notorious for developing problems in their wrists. Things like tendinitis, things like carpal tunnel syndrome, if you're familiar with what those are. Athletes, tennis players get these same problems with their joints. So the 5-minute rule is just a guideline. It's not, you don't force yourself to go 5 minutes. Okay, next line of the equation here is one of the most important ones, with drums. One of the most important things you'll ever learn from me about rhythm in music, and one of my great secret weapons for getting yourself to where you can control rhythm, is this. We'll write down here at the bottom of the page. Get a time keeper. Because the truth of the matter is, it's pretty much pointless to play without one. Now, I don't know whether anyone's ever told you that before, but if you ask me, one thing you need to understand is that not only do you have to play the chord, but you have to deal with the rhythmic content of that chord too. And the only way that people ever develop stage-usable control of rhythm in a reasonable amount of time is by working out with some kind of mechanical timekeeper, some kind of a beat-keeping device. Now, back in the old days, we had these things called metronomes. They're still around. They just made this clicking sound. You might have had one or seen one or know somebody who does. They're okay to practice with, but hey, it's 1999. We've got some other tools around that are actually almost more fun and more valuable to use. One of them, of course, is, do you have one of these plastic keyboards, these department type keyboard instruments kicking around your house somewhere. If you do, you may well know that these things have a little drum machine built inside them. And you can hit the red button here and start that beat going. You can also adjust the tempo of it. Now listen to how I can make this go faster by pushing this button right here. See, I'm going a lot faster now, or I can slow it down and go slower. That's where this next line comes in, slow as you need. You don't want to drive yourself crazy with your drum machine clacking in your ear. You try to set that machine to exactly where you can handle playing the chord, getting there in the amount of time that you want to get there. And then as you work at that a little more, your fingers get there quicker and quicker, so you speed your machine up a little more. So you practice it maybe for 5 minutes, kind of at this next faster speed. And then you're up to the next faster speed than that. The beauty of these machines also are that they have this machine here has 100 different beat patterns. So for all different styles of music, with 100 different beat patterns to choose from in your beat keeping machine, you'll find something that will work reasonably well for just about any song you'll ever play. The other cool thing about practicing with a drum machine is it makes practicing more fun. Here you are, you're trying to play rock and roll music. You're trying to practice your chords. You've got 3 choices. Practice with nothing, practice with a metronome, practice with a drum machine. What's going to be more fun? Well, chances are the song that you're playing has drums in it, so it would probably stand to reason that it would be actually more fun to practice this stuff with a drum machine going than without it. Metronomes are okay, but the one problem you're going to encounter is they usually aren't very loud, so if you're playing electric guitar, you can't really hear yourself. These things, if you want to actually, you can actually plug this into your amplifier or plug this into your stereo, and you can make it as loud as you want. There are other reasons why these are superior timekeepers, too. They tell you more than just the tempo of the beat. They actually tell you what beat of the pattern you're on, because different drum sounds in the drum kit, like the kick drum and the snare drum and the hi-hat and the tom-toms, generally fall on different beats out of the pattern. We won't go into that right now. So, get a timekeeper. It's pointless to practice without one. I don't mean absolutely pointless, but remember, if we're suggesting that you're going to learn in half the time if you practice this way, that's pretty cool, isn't it? Like I say, you can take an hour to learn this chord, or you can take 2 hours to learn it. And that's a pretty significant thing. So if you're not practicing with a timekeeper, it may not be absolutely pointless. You may not be completely wasting your time, but in a way, you are wasting half your time. And that's a pretty significant thing over the course of your career. So these things aren't very expensive. I'll tell you a little more next week about what to look for when you buy one of these, but pretty much anything would be better than nothing. We'll go on to that next time. Another thing we're going to talk about next time also is a little bit more about how to count in 4 and use that to challenge yourself more and more as you're practicing. So, quick little review of what we've been talking about today. We filled in a few more little facts on our chord sheet here. We got finally the rest of the chords plugged in. We hadn't seen that major 7 there yet with its angled bar finger back there. Some of these variations on these chords that we learned. Try playing those different variations. You'll see they sound similar to the other ways to play the chord, but also have a little bit of a different spin to them. Another thing that we looked at was chord names. And that's how you need to be able to look at the name of a chord and figure out what to actually do with your fingers. And remember, chord names have 3 parts. The root note of the chord, the type of chord, and the form that you're playing in. We also learned this very potent little methodology for actually practicing chords. The sad truth about chords is it's not enough just to know how to play that chord. You also need to be able to get your fingers there instantly, just like that. Best way I ever found to do it is follow this little methodology here. Practice chords in pairs. Back and forth every 4 beats. For like 5 minutes at a time, or until your hand just can't do it anymore. with drums or with a metronome, with some kind of beat-keeping device. Everybody else waits too long and their sense of rhythm doesn't really develop. Slow as you need. Don't drive yourself crazy with that thing going too fast. Think ahead and listen to yourself. Make sure the chord is coming out sounding good. You'll learn in half the time. Okay, that's enough to stuff your heads with for today. We got a little more to talk about chords next time, but until then, check out your book there and look and start working on learning your different chord forms. I'm Scotty West, and we'll see you next time on Absolutely Understand Guitar, okay? Bye-bye.